The first time I had to come up with subject number 3, it was very less refined than you can imagine. Well, maybe you can imagine it quite a lot. I mean, who the hell does get their story first, right on the first draft? Anyway, the idea for subject number 3 came to me when I was kind of an addiction with America Online. Back in the late 90s, I was like a very, very imaginative kid, a teen, practically, right? I was very much into role-playing on on chat rooms. If you remember chat rooms in AOL, you probably, some people who already obviously grew up in the 90s did. And there was a few concepts that I had already thought about for subject number 3. First of all was actually creation of a character that was part of a genetic experiment who could heal and heal himself. Basically, his whole body can regenerate, and essentially was kind of my avatar for that those role-playing sessions. And it was pretty much it wasn't pretty much, yeah, it was just me with regenerating powers. Sorry, just to spoil the fact that book that I had made was kind of a self-insert. I mean, the concept of the book was based around a self-insert. I just, but I was, but essentially it was just, it was no rhyme or reason to a lot of what we had on those role-playing sessions. My character was essentially a person who was part of a big genetic experiment, and there was others like him, and but there wasn't like a sort of coherent plot. I mean, one moment where I'm flying a TIE fighter for crying out loud. You wouldn't get away that on a science fiction novel. It also ended up, at one point, I'm not kidding, driving around in a post-apocalyptic New York City where a bunch of lizard people have taken over. Actually, not really lizard people, but like giant lizards who like have who eat people and all that. And it's like driving around in dune buggies in this post-apocalyptic New York City. Is just the early, just their strangeness, trash. And just about, aside from the concept of the character, one of the main characters, pretty much my novel now uses none of that. There was like a lot of really silly shit that I had originally planned for the story that I pretty much threw right out the window. Not that window back there. I just threw out, right? When I had first got to the definitive ideas of the story, I had that image in my mind, an image of a child lit on fire, falling right down in front of a woman driving a car, and the woman pretty much almost hits the child, and she opens the door. It's big shock, you know, seeing a child immolated right in front of her. It just literally fell into her life. Yeah. And then suddenly, as she thought she could, like, this is some sort of horrible act, some sort of horrible murder that she's just witnessed. The child comes up. The child, like, raises his whole upper body alive with third-degree burns all over him, but still very much alive, and still on fire, too. It's like flames are still all around him. And essentially, the woman, that is the main character of this story, named Nara Gates, looks in shock at this child who has just fallen from a great height, on fire, and yet still lives. And suddenly, as the child essentially is fanning the flames off of himself, his body starts to mend itself. All the scars and all the third-degree burns start to heal on his face, on his hands, and all that stuff. It's like Nara looks on with utter shock and awe that this child, not just falling into her life, just survived and is pretty much can heal himself. If essentially you think of Wolverine, that kind of thing, in which how a body heals after being damaged a great deal. That's essentially the same token with the child's main character they have written that was based upon a character I role-played as. Oh, I am trying, I do try to make sure over time with developing the story that much of my self-insert is really less and less into the story. I mean, there's a few elements to it that reflects on my own life, but as far as something like a child being like a Mary Sue to the story, or a Gary Stu, which is some people call the male equivalent of a Mary Sue, or an author avatar. I try and pretty much weave this story around this child without making him like, oh god, he's the biggest thing, he's like a flawless, a precious cinnamon bun that needs protecting. I pretty much have that sort of idea in which a character I've avatared as essentially grow out of the avatar state. And essentially what I wanted to do was, but I just thought there was something from my original role-playing that I wanted to build upon, and that is this concept of a child, an ordinary child, suddenly getting these extraordinary things being put onto him by a victim of a genetic experiment. And as you can imagine from the title subject number 3, that he wasn't the first either. And what basically the plot revolves on subject number 3 is between Nara and this child, that from the first time I really decided to make this story into a novel or something like that, is deciding that Nara would be kind of the focal point. That it wouldn't be on this child, it would be on Nara, a 24-year-old woman who has pretty much never been into any sort of fantastical world. She's never witnessed a child who has healed himself. Essentially, going into a whole world of absolute fantastical stuff with very blue, very green, very much not aware this sort of stuff is happening. And just be kind of that sort of, it is kind of a common trope in certain fiction that you see, that stories focus on characters who aren't normally involved on this sort of story. I mean, you had Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, or you had Star Wars be with the start out with the droids as opposed to like Leia or Luke or any of those characters, right? Or maybe even as much as like I can think of a video game example of like one character from X-Men Legends. Actually, one of the first characters introduced is actually in pretty much a window into the video game world of X-Men, right? And someone else. But anyway, about Nara, to explain a bit further about Nara is that I had made a concerted effort to make the character of Nara be the I not concede that effort, but I made an effort to make the character of Nara just essentially the kind of an average lower middle class person who actually has dropped out of college, works at a job at kind of a degrading job at a diner, like retro diner, in which I make the distinction of her look on the opening cover, essentially, and for some parts of the novel is her wearing kind of a cocktail dress with her name kind of written on this side, well, whatever, on this side in cursive, right? And essentially building her character as a kind of person who is kind of really fed up with this world. This world is essentially what a lot of fears in America, like if a lot of apathy has taken over, that the government doesn't really care too much about its people. It's been letting it basically go to hell, essentially. Letting businesses close up, letting people be unemployed, let a lot of things just go to hell, essentially. That leaving a lot of people in the dust, and some not even fortunate to to live by, right? And one of the things I also written in is that Nara also takes some time to take care of some orphans. Cliche, I know, but I just wanted to make that connection very strong on the onset of Nara and this child, is that Nara has a very maternal instinct towards the child, even with him being on fire and healing himself, essentially. Just feels an inclination to want to protect him, want to make sure that he finds the right place, essentially find a place for him, you know? But, of course, with a child that is able to survive third-degree burns and a very high fall, it is not to say that there isn't, like, some sort of interest in this child, and that the child is being tracked down. Essentially, the child spurs the interests of two different types of groups. One group who wants to destroy the child, and the other who wants to capture him to further the experiment. Essentially, Nara is the barrier between these two groups getting to the child, right? And essentially, as the story progresses, the child, it pretty much becomes increasingly difficult to really protect the child, to shield him from these forces of nature that's trying to get him for either life or death, right? And they both converge in certain ways in which that will very much challenge her idea of whether or not this child is worth protecting. That all that she feels towards this child, all that she wants to be there to be her kind of be her mama bear to her cub, is that a lot of things just it just makes it harder and harder for her to find if whether or not keeping the child around is worth it. That and I just want to make that real dilemma, is that something that trying to put instincts, kind of maternal instincts, whether or not very much challenging her inclination to protect those she feels is helpless, or feel is the target of a greater force at work. Greater forces at work, as there is two groups, right? And so yeah, that and what makes compound it further, I decide this very much early on, is that the child would not have much in terms of dialogue, that he would not speak or anything like, be able to explain this to her flat out, and that pretty much the only words they says on the onset is her name, Nara. That it's pretty much adding to the whole mystery of this child, is why he was part of this genetic experiment, and how he ended up falling literally into her life, right? Is definitely the driving force of the story. And as it progresses, it definitely details become clearer, and we do get to know both of these groups in a bit more intimate detail, right? And though at a particular moment in time, I haven't known if I have quite the pacing or structure down yet. I mean, a lot of the first few chapters so far has been it starts out in media res, starts out with with the first meeting of the Nara and the child, right? And then it goes to kind of a quieter moment, then gets to another action moment, then gets to a bit of a quieter moment, then an action moment, and then it spends a couple of chapters trying to explain why those events had to happen. Essentially, I just front-loaded with this kind of structure, and yet and then I just decide to devote a whole string of chapters to just explain it. And this is just the first part of the novel. I have the novel split off. I at least plan to have the novel split out into 3 parts, dealing with certain story elements, right? And essentially what just what thinking is like, that is why, for one thing, is like a lot of the years I have written this story have barely gotten anyone to really refine it, really give me outside criticism to really push the story in the direction it needs to be. And that's why I was planning on a crowdfunding effort for the novel, is because I want to be able to afford an editor, for one thing. And there's other things like, of course, I'd like to have a professional illustrator. I'd like to be able to print books, maybe in a limited capacity, but print the books nonetheless. And just essentially a lot of things I would want to do with this story to really push it forward. I've worked on over nearly 2 decades with this story. And essentially, a lot of it has been going on through a lot of revisions, believe me, to which certain story elements, even entire characters, were removed. But that sort of thing about work is that you never get right the first time, or the 70th, for that matter. But essentially, reason why I went out, as I've probably explained, the reason why I went out and kind of unmasked the Fluffy Man was to pretty much get this this novel to limelight. Make sure that Nara and the child are able to, basically, the story of their being and the story of pretty much the driving force of their struggling through well, essentially it's more Nara's struggle about going through all these fantastical elements and understanding why everything that happens needed to happen, right? And what it would mean to the reader, what mean for the reader. Because if anything, reason why it has been so difficult to nail down this story is because I don't know if there has been quite the audience for it. Is that a lot of ideas that I've had would probably not fly for a modern story. I mean, just, I have had some really insane ideas for this novel. I mean, really insane. Some of which appear in a milder form in the story itself. But essentially, so I really, just essentially trying to shoot for the moon, but then just kind of scaling back, pulling back to think, maybe I'm really going on the wrong trajectory there. That certain things I have had in the story, certain elements that I thought would be a good thing to put in, but really just pull back and think this doesn't work at all. And for instance, I just had been really as much as importance Nara has to the story, there has been certain elements in which I really feel right now a bit uncomfortable trying to do, right? I mean, she was essentially, she isn't like kind of any sort of action protagonist, she's kind of the person who, and like a action participant in certainly these elements, and it makes it kind of hard to not put her into the damsel role at times. I know, and but way I have it's like a part of my mind thinks no, don't do this at all and stuff. But for some elements of the story to progress, I thought I have to delve into the certain cliches, right? That but right now the state of her damsel status is nowhere near as bad as it was originally. And of course, the child, being based upon someone I came up for myself, elements of his kind of Gary Stu, Mary Sue thing kind of have lessened over time as well. And he still pretty much provides a central element to the story, but he's not like a flawless paragon or anything like that. Not like written as everybody is enamored over him, or he's a flawless being himself, right? That. But essentially, yeah, it's just when you become aware of certain storytelling tropes, a lot of things can change. Like, for instance, there is this other character that I had just pretty much removed as more of a supporting role, in which he essentially plays as kind of like the Michael Biehn role in Terminator. You know, the one who was to Sarah Connor, like it says, "Come with me if you want to live." Yeah. Yeah, I decided, I mean, as late as recently, I just thought, this character's not interesting at all. This is just essentially, pretty much a knockoff of a much better character, or a better character archetype, right? So, I decided to not completely nix him, but to kind of give him a bit more of a supporting role, and actually gave the role a bit more to a more interesting character that is actually becomes a bit more humanizing to Nara about the whole situation about the child, right? As on a bit more of a relatable level. And as opposed to something offhand just telling her that, yeah, you're fucked, there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah. That's essentially kind of was the original tone that this Michael Bain kind of character had. And there was like a lot of changes made over time from what he was originally to that that still didn't work, right? Because, just to think is that right now I am working out another draft of the story. And I think at this particular point in time, I have thought of the sort of direction I want to take the story, so it could feel very enclosed in, because I am actually still planning on making this into a series of novels. The particular problem with this one, though, as the introduction to everything, is that whether or not I really want to keep it, a lot of it contained, how much I want to keep it contained, and how much I want to leave it open to further stories, further novels that take the story into very different directions, like we get to know a bit more about the universe these characters live in, get to know a bit more details, and are things that weren't exactly well known in the first novel, right? That's one thing that sequels can do, is expand upon the story. Oh, this one, I try to keep a lot of it self-contained, even if a lot of it happens in the past. Essentially, this story comes after the tail end of a lot of big happenings, big stories that have already happened. And essentially some of it's explained and others are actually told in flashback. In fact, the second part of the novel is pretty much almost entirely a flashback. That just kind of is wedged in between because it would become the driving force in the third act, the sort of thing that were established in the second, right? And the one thing that I would definitely think of is, it's also hard to really think of where I really want to put this further into the future if I ever actually do produce more novels after this. More novels set in the same universe, or essentially sequels, is whether or not I have really a big beginning, middle, and end. I do know where the journey is going to end, but getting there is just going to take a bit of really thinking out how I can push towards that direction. Really thinking out so that the end of the journey doesn't feel like it wasn't deserved, that wasn't earned, right? Because you see some stories fall apart because where the end of the journey doesn't really feel like it was leading there. It was essentially not very well thought out. I mean, look at certain TV shows that be able to suffer towards the end, that the filmmakers didn't really, the storytellers and writers didn't really plan out that much, so when it gets to its conclusion, it just feels kinda weak. Yeah. And just thinking of, like, the X-Files or other shows or stuff like that. And I haven't really read all of Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, but some people feel like it ends kind of on a note as well. And Orson Scott Card's Ender series really begun being very full of itself, being full of its universe, self-importance, that sort of thing. It just felt, as the time went on, it just felt less really interesting, and especially with the Shadow series, it just really becomes so mired in its politics, it just really lost me. Just really didn't feel as interesting as it first was, right? And, yeah. So, what I would think is, like, if I am able to really nail this first novel, then maybe I can really worry about coming up with the rest. Because the one thing is, like, it started out as this story that I came up as kind of a fantasy for myself. Now I want to make it into a Kickstarter for a series that hopefully some people will like. I know others probably will not like it, right? It's who makes the ideal piece of work, who makes the ideal piece of novel or movie or video game for that matter, is that that finds some audience, so I'd be able to give myself the inspiration to start a new story that would be able to branch off of that and hopefully be very at least interesting, be very notable, right? I mean, it could be big, it could be, right? But it also could just fall into obscurity. I mean, this is pretty much a project that's starting in small, very small, and I'm not really imagining it anything big or anything like that, suddenly somebody's going to call my door and say, we want to make a movie out of your novel or anything like that. Though I have imagined how it would appear in a movie, don't get me wrong. Right? Yeah, I don't have any delusions that something I came up as a role-playing idea would end up being the next Harry Potter, the next Hunger Games, the next any sort of those big novels. Right. But, I just want to know I just want to tell you how much, how really, my thought process has been on over the several years, and give you a little taste on what is to expect from my novel. And, I have no idea when I'm going to start that Kickstarter campaign. I have to first make a pitch video. This isn't the pitch video, by the way. So, big surprise, video diary is not a Kickstarter pitch video, right? Or a Indiegogo or GoFundMe, that sort of thing, right? Look at my options, too, right? It's, right now I have work, I have a lot of things that, kind of prevent me from, getting as productive on it as I can, except maybe for writing out a draft of the novel. I've been kind of on a roll recently. But, at this particular moment, it's kind of still rough state. It's still kind of rough state, because, there is still quite a bit to do in order to get this, out to, people so that they'd be able to become aware of it. I mean, I tried starting a Tumblr, but that's barely gotten any attention. I barely posted on it. And I've also just been haven't really been pushing it out as a promotion. I barely even mention it on Twitter or Tumblr or anywhere else for that matter. But I will try to, as much as I can, to really these video diaries just essentially to laugh some steam somewhat, and make sure that at least I become somewhat active in trying to get this story a bit more awareness, because I really want to be able to get this out there and for it to be judged, to be criticized, to be praised, but to get out there so that I would feel like the years I've made into working on this story really meant something, really meant more than just role-playing on a chat room.